All right, everyone. I think we're going to attempt to get started here. It's a rowdy crowd. I like this. It's a call to action, right? So we have all, I guess we do have, we can claim standing room only at the back there, which is gratifying. So thank you all for coming. For those of you who don't know, I'm Christopher Bedford, and I'm the Dorothy Wagner Wallace, director of the Baltimore Museum of Art, and I've been practicing that title for quite some time now. That might be my first successful utterance. So it's a thank you. So first of all, I want to thank all of you for taking the time to be here. I know 6:30 to 8:30 on a Thursday is like the weekend. It's close to the weekend. Should be the weekend. So I'm grateful that you're all taking the time. I want to thank all the BMA trustees who are here for your incredible advocacy. I think what you're going to find throughout the course of this evening's program is that this museum is beginning to chart an extremely new course. And I'm grateful to the museum's trustees for being amenable to exploring that course and being so incredibly supportive in our initial efforts. So this is an awakening, I'd say, and I'm very glad to be here with all of you. I also want to thank the BMA staff who did a lot to make this possible. I should tell you we did a dry run of this program this morning for the staff and the trustees, and it was extraordinary. So I think you're in for a treat, and the staff were all present and very receptive, so thanks to you guys. And then to Beyond Conflict, and my friend Tim Phillips, and others for collaborating with us and organizing what I think is going to be an extraordinary evening. So I'm going to offer a few brief framing comments and then turn it over to the far more interesting people to my left. But I think I wanted to begin by telling you about the initial tenure of my recruitment to this museum. So I was going through the interview process to become the next director of the BMA, and anybody who's been through the process of a museum directorship interview, it's not the most pleasant. You know, you sit in front of what looks like a firing squad, and they fire questions at you, and you feel peppered and harassed. And then at the very end of the process, you get a chance to ask your own questions. So the question I asked was, what do you want somebody to say about the BMA in an elevator if they had 15 seconds to do so? So the person leading that search was Mike Rosenbaum. And he told me that he wanted it to be the singularly most socially engaged, dynamic institution in this country, and one that could provide a model for all others. So I had never heard a response quite like that before. And I committed myself to pursuing this job at that moment. Unfortunately, I was given the opportunity. So I would say that implied in that comment was the mandate that we completely reorient the museum towards and to become a culture of inclusion in the way that is necessary to retain our relevance in Baltimore. So a phrase I use often talking to both the staff and the trustees is that I don't believe the future of museums is going to be written in New York or in Los Angeles. I think it will be written here. And I think that's because we have the vision and the energy for it, but I also think it's because there's a mandate. And the mandate arises from the fact that we will institutionally become irrelevant if we do not understand ourselves differently relative to the city. So I would say in New York or Los Angeles, you have an enormous, educated, moneyed, self-selecting group of art world tourists who will come to see anything you do. They'll pay exorbitant amounts of money for it, and they expect it. And if those people don't come, you have millions of tourists to fill the gap. So we, as a city, do not luxuriate in those conditions. We have to earn our relationship to the city and to its constituents. And what I'll say is that this is a beginning of that process of earning a different sort of relationship. So anybody who knows anything about museums knows that our core is acquisitions, exhibitions, and public programs. So what I'll say to you is that this is not a rhetorical moment in which I'm simply speaking about the prospect of a new future. It's something that we've already begun and will continue to build on as the years go by. I'm also acutely aware of the fact that as a museum culture, we may not have the skill set necessary to recreate ourselves in a different image. If that were the case, then the Baltimore Museum of Art would not need to become a model for all other museums. We'd be following somebody else. So I think it's our charge to become part of a vanguard and reestablish a different level of trust with the city, become home for its constituents in the truest sense, and change what's at our core in order to achieve that mission. So we have grand ambition, And I think we have the right people to help us announce that mission. And I count among those my friend and colleague, Tim Phillips, who I'm going to introduce now, very briefly. So Tim, I got to know during my time in Boston. He's an unusual hybrid figure who straddles the world of social activism, peace and reconciliation, and collecting. So he was perfect for my role at Brandeis as the director of the Rose Art Museum with a deep investment in social justice. So I was searching around for collectors who were like-minded, and as you might imagine, there aren't too many of those in the world, who believe in social justice as much as they believe in the accumulation of objects. So Tim is exactly... Tim is exactly that unusual person. And I count him among a very small group of lifelong friends and somebody I can collaborate with, be friends with, and imagine a different future for an institution with and through. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about what Beyond Conflict does, because Tim will do a far better job. But he's been involved in this work for many, many decades, has worked in South Africa, has worked in Northern Ireland, has worked in Bahrain, and is beginning work in Israel and Palestine. So not the easiest context, but he is definitely the man for the job. So Tim, you want to come and take the helm? Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. I should say that there's a particular resonance for me being from Boston here in Baltimore. If you've been watching the Red Sox and the Baltimore Orioles the last few days. So why am I here tonight, and why is Beyond Conflict here talking at the Baltimore Museum of Art, or any art museum about issues of inclusion? And it also relates to what I said about what we've all read in what happened at Fenway Park. So I grew up in Boston. About 25 years ago, I founded or co-founded a nonprofit to work starting in Eastern and Central Europe in 1991, when the transitions were starting to take place from communism to democracy. And I often like to joke, being the youngest child of a large family, that I had a problem with authority. And I was traveling through the region, and I started to meet all these new dissidents who are now running these post-communist countries. And I thought, well, probably the last thing they want to hear from is a self-described expert coming in saying, here's how you write a constitution, here's how you build a democracy, and here's how you deal with the legacy of repression. I thought, but what I'd really be interested in hearing, and I thought they may as well, is to hear from people who themselves have been through a transition from dictatorship to democracy. And in 1991, you had fewer examples than we have today. You had Argentina and Chile. You had Spain after Franco, Greece after their dictatorship, and denazification in Germany. So I convinced some people with money, a guy named George Soros, who I'd never heard of, and I said, I'd like to bring together the new leaders of these post-communist countries with people who themselves have struggled with change. And Soros liked it. And he said, I'll fund it. So we organized this conference February of 1992, so it's our 25th anniversary, a month ago, 2 months ago. And it was eclectic, like this panel tonight. And what we did was we brought people from these other countries to say that not only is change possible, but we can learn from the experience of others. Because I had a lot of people tell me, and I was in my late 20s at the time, that every country was unique from each other. There is no cross-cultural learning. And maybe because I grew up in my own experience of feeling sort of marginalized, excluded, and not listened to, that no, I think people can learn from each other. People don't respond to repression through their national identity card. They respond as humans. And I believed then and came to learn that same thing would happen in Eastern and Central Europe. And so what happened was, in this conference that brought together these incredible leaders, they came to find they had profound things in common. They didn't have a word in their language for compromise. They were afraid of compromise. They didn't know what it was to listen to the other. They thought as victims, nobody could understand their suffering. Nobody knew what it was like to live under repression or military dictatorship, that nobody would understand it, therefore they can't learn from others. But what happened over those 2 or 3 days is people started seeing, wow, there is this shared human experience. And there's something liberating, empowering to know that people came out the other side. There wasn't like this sort of kumbaya aha moment. I think we all know that as humans we're wired for homeostasis, to stay the same. But change can take place, and it's empowering to see others who have done it. And so with that sort of initial response, and it's always good to come to the market with a good idea with funding, I had funders who said this has to continue. And so starting in 1992, we took this sort of what I called a big support group on wheels around the world. We took them to El Salvador at the signing of the peace accords. We took them back to Central and Eastern Europe. We took them to South Africa, and you'll hear from Ibrahim Rasool, after they negotiated the end of apartheid, but the South Africans, the government, the ANC, about to have an election, wanted to know about how do we deal with our past. And so one of the things we did was help bring the model of the truth commissions in Argentina and Chile to South Africa. And so over the last 25 years, we've worked around the world with, I like to think, a very humble approach, which is that people can truly learn from others. Change is possible, but it takes time. And if there's one thing that I learned, is that exclusion has been and is the main driver of conflict around the world. And the flip side of that, and Ibrahim will talk about it, is that they couldn't negotiate the end of apartheid until they actually made the process inclusive. So for 2 or 3 years, the ANC, of which Ibrahim was a leading member, or the National Party and others, they tried to have negotiations just between themselves. And they came to realize it wasn't working, that we had to bring all the small parties and others to the table. The same thing happened in Northern Ireland with the Good Friday Agreement and many others. They came to realize that we had to really make this inclusive, or this stuff won't work and stick. And so over the years, the flip side of that, exclusion and inclusion, were central to both the cause and sustaining of some of the most brutal conflicts or dictatorships around the world, and the only way they found a way out of apartheid or to the Good Friday Agreement or to the Salvadoran peace process or X, Y, and Z was to truly make it inclusive. And so we're always looking for tools to show people that change is possible. So a few years ago, I had the pleasure of meeting Rebecca Saxe, who you'll hear from, and doing leading research in sort of behavioral science, particularly brain science, about what it is to be human. And I started to see, wow, the evidence, the knowledge, the research coming out of behavioral science is as profound as what human experience shows us. That we need to be heard and seen and understood as we see ourselves, to A, think rationally, and to fully engage in the world. That we experience social rejection as physical pain in our brains. That the part of our brain that registers trauma can't fully differentiate between emotional and physical trauma. To be excluded, to be marginalized, is experienced as pain. And so the more we started looking at this, thinking, what are the biggest social challenges we face in the world and in our country? Are we really approaching these the way humans actually think and operate? Or are we approaching them with this sort of outdated Enlightenment view that humans are rational beings and they'll figure it out through interest and self-interest, where that sort of theory and game is over? And if we really want to understand the fundamental challenges we face, we have to A, understand what human experience has shown us and what science shows us about what it is to be human. And so 2 years ago, I grew up in Boston, you may hear from my accent, and the new mayor came in, and my colleague and I were giving a talk in Chinatown in Boston to the Asian American Civic Association. Now, we're not scientists, so we can say almost anything, but we're there talking about resilience, trauma, and bias. And it was 2 months after Ferguson. And this young African-American woman raised her hand and said, "Are all white cops racist?" And I stood there and I thought, there are a lot of racist cops out there. But I would venture to say that most are not racist, but every cop is biased because every human being is biased. I said a few blocks from where we were speaking, there's a Museum of Fine Arts, and if you get too close to a great masterpiece, the silent alarm goes off. And you stand there saying, where the hell did that come from? And I said, that's sort of how bias works in the brain. And in that room was the new head of public safety for the new mayor of Boston. He was head of the gang unit for the district attorney for 18 years. And he said, I really like the way you answered that question. And when I asked him why, he said, because I didn't feel shamed. He said, it gave me an entry point, so when I can go back and talk to the cops here in Boston, they're not going to shut me down. And we had some meetings with the top command of the Boston Police and others. And one of the things, and I have to say, it was like stages of grief, that he said, and the new mayor said, one of the things that shocked us the most when they came into office was to learn that Boston is viewed by people of color outside as the most racist city in America. And I literally went through stages of grief. And I thought, well, what the hell are we going to do about this? And then I realized that the last 25 years of working around the world was in preparation for taking this home. To come to my city of Boston and say, you know what? I guess I was shaped 25 years ago by my experience growing up in Boston, in my sort of working class community and background. When my African-American friends reminded me who I grew up with, that what it was to always be shrinking to make white people comfortable, I said, yeah, I know what that felt like. Not that I had to make white people comfortable, but I had to make people around me comfortable. And I said, how do we take this home? How do we take these experiences that Ibrahim and others have learned around the world to not only Boston, but Baltimore, and every part of this country? And what can behavioral science add to that? Because if we don't, particularly at this moment, understand what inclusion really means, then we're in deep trouble. Because what behavioral science shows is inclusion is a subjective felt experience. Too often we think of inclusion and diversity as a human resources challenge or a compliance issue or something we do here. And even if you're thoughtful, liberal, and progressive, that's an attaboy and attagirl. No. Inclusion is a subjective feeling. Do you belong? Are you seen? Are you heard as you see yourself? And a retired neuroscientist who actually got us involved, or got me involved in this, said something so profound. He said, we are not rational beings with emotions. At our core, he said, speaking scientifically, we are emotionally based beings who can only think rationally when we feel that our identities are understood and valued by others. And if you've been traumatized, and if you come from a community that's been traumatized, over a long period of time, there is a biological basis to be heard and seen as you see yourself. And that is a profound truth. And so as we said to the police and the mayor and other people in Boston, you've got two overburdened communities. You've got communities of color who have been screwed time and time again, and they talk to themselves time and time again, and they're tired. And you got the police in the city who, for their own issues, are overburdened. If we really want to make this city more inclusive, we all have to get involved. And how do you do that? How do you get people of power and privilege to wake up? How do you get them to understand the lived experience of others? Because social media is showing us what every person of color has known for decades. Forgive me for saying this shit happens all the time. But it isn't just what we see when a person of color interacts with the police. It's that daily lived experience, the accumulation of daily slights, daily discrimination, and daily humiliation. Now, I can tell you from my own experience, I knew what that felt like when I was a kid. And what Rebecca and others will point out that science shows us is context is really important. Even empathy. You know, in my field, we talk about promoting empathy. Well, you know, empathy is contingent upon context and proximity. It's the ability to put yourself in the mind of another person, which means that you can experience what they're experiencing, or at least you have a context for what that felt like. And I'll end by saying, if you remember over a year ago, that image of that young Syrian child who drowned off of Turkey, so why do we all know that image and not the hundreds of images that were above the fold in major American newspapers and others of people fleeing Aleppo, or of a father holding his dead son or daughter? Because those images of horror are not easily accessible by the human brain, even for Syrians today. It's out of context. We don't live that way most of the time. But we do dress like that young boy, or our children dress like that young boy, wearing sneakers, wearing blue shorts, and a policeman lifting his body off a beach. So your brain could access the context. That could be off the eastern shore, that could be in Cape Cod, that could be somewhere. And proximity, that could be a beach down the street. And that happens in milliseconds. So we pick that up pretty damn quickly because it could be a threat. And it's something we need to know. So if we really want to understand the other, we have to understand how we access another's experience. And I think that's part of the contribution we're trying to make. And I'll just end by saying, why a museum? Because what I found in my hometown, and I think what Chris and others are finding here, you know, these institutions were built when our countries were pretty homogeneous, white, mostly Christian. It was part of the Enlightenment tradition, the civilizing tradition. Well, I don't have to tell you, Baltimore is about 70% African American. Boston is about 53% people of color. So who do you represent? How do you remain relevant to your community when they don't see themselves there, when they don't feel included, when they don't feel acknowledged? Because if we don't understand that, then the gates go up higher and higher, and then we don't exist. And so what I think Chris articulated is that the ability and the necessity for institutions, and not just art museums, but all institutions, to realize that relevance depends on meaning, and meaning for people in the community they serve. And this is a paradigm shift. This is a revolution. This is generational work. But this is what profound lessons have come from around the world, and I think also what science is showing us. So this is just a beginning. And so with that, I want to thank you for being here, and I want to introduce Rebecca, who warned me not to say anything really nice about her. But I will say this, she is truly one of the most brilliant neuroscientists of her generation. And she's going to speak next, so thank you.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much, Tim, for that introduction, and thank you, Chris, for having us and for the vision of this event. So I think it's likely you're wondering, as I am, what I'm doing here. Because as Tim said, I'm a scientist. I study the human brain, and in particular, human brain development. And it's not often that I'm asked to speak in an art museum. So I was thinking about why Tim invites me to do these things, and I think it's in part because, for me, science is a lens on human experience. Science is a way for me and for the people I train to connect our individual lives to a larger narrative of how we make meaning. And it's an exciting way to do that. It offers incredibly powerful tools, but also a vocabulary, and in particular, an external perspective, a way of looking at ourselves from the outside, that can sometimes make it easier to approach really hard questions that touch profoundly on our personal experiences and are hard to disentangle from our emotions. Questions about human development, speaking as a parent, but also questions about morality, questions about justice, and questions about race. And so I hope that by bringing science to an art museum, I can offer some vocabulary, some ways of thinking about the human experience that might give us a context in which we can approach issues about race and justice. So as I say, I study the human brain in my lab at MIT. And where this tells me to start in trying to understand any hard human problem is a basic truth about how human brains work, which is that we use our brains to think, to plan, to see, to feel, and in order to do that, we have to transform the input of our experience, the objects that we see, the people, the scenes, into decisions and actions and feelings. And to do that, we shape that input into the feelings, decisions, and actions through expectations. So we learn and we evolve to know what to expect, and that gives us a heads up. It makes us faster, it makes us more efficient, it makes us more accurate. And it lets us do the remarkably human intelligence, getting so much from so little, going so far beyond the data, all the things we can do so much better than computers can. So just to give you a sense of what I mean, I'm going to start with an example. I actually often start with this example. It only occurred to me today how relevant this is in an art gallery, because this is an example of something artists have known forever. Right? That when you see lines of paint on a page, what you experience, what you feel, is not about just the literal details, where the colors are, but about how it relates to what we expect, how it fulfills and violates our expectations. So I'm going to give you an incredibly simple example, not like the art on the walls here. An example of a structural prior we bring to the world, to how we interpret our experience. And this is the prior that our visual system evolved with to expect that light comes from above. So to give you a sense of this example, I want you to look at these dots. You can see there's a whole bunch of dots in this display, and one of them is different. Now, of course, these are just patterns of light and dark on a two-dimensional screen, but I think you'll see that one of them looks different in depth. So that one that looks different, to how many people does it look like it's protruding out at you? Put your hand up if it looks like it's coming at you, the one that's different. And how many people feel like it's receding away from you? Okay, so if you see it receding away from you, the only way you can possibly do that is if you assume the light comes from above. When light comes from above, then the internal surface is lit of a receding dot, the external surface is lit of a protruding dot. Now that perception is so basic, our visual system evolved for it so long ago that baby chicks see that illusion the day that they're born. Just to show you that it is an illusion, here's the same image. I'm just going to rotate it 180 degrees. And now you should see that the single dot protrudes towards you. Right now the light looks like it's coming from above. Okay, so we see these images in depth because of an evolved expectation that lets us see more than there is. What there is pixels on a screen, but what you see is depth. And you get that extra by interpreting the data through the lens of expectations that your brain evolved to have. Now, of course, it's possible for light to come from below. It's not that light from below is impossible. It's just that it's unlikely, right? That our visual system evolved to give us more than the data based on what's probable and what we can expect. And that's why if you put a flashlight under your chin at a campfire, your face looks so freaky. Okay, so what does this have to do with race and justice? Well, just like we bring our expectations to interpret the ambiguities and patterns of light, we also bring powerful expectations to our interactions with one another. So the things that we see other people do, the way that they act and react, those are also ambiguous. And we have to interpret them, get so much more than the pixels, the data of our interactions, by bringing powerful expectations. But in this context, when it's interpersonal, that ability to interpret the same behavior with profoundly different feelings, decisions, and actions based on our expectations of that person or the group they belong to can have much more negative consequences than when seeing things in depth. part of where this negativity comes from is a fundamental double standard we have for ourselves and those we consider us versus other people, those we consider them. This is such a basic difference that social psychologists call it the fundamental attribution error. And I'll describe it to you. It may seem familiar, right? The fundamental attribution error says that if you need to interpret my behaviors through the lens of your expectations, here's my expectations for myself. Anything I do, I had good intentions and I was basically competent. So if I succeed, you should interpret that as evidence of my effort and competence. If I fail, that was because of the unavoidable impossibility of a difficult situation outside of myself. I can be held responsible for the consequences of my actions only if I knew about them in advance, and only if those actions occurred recently, so if they're relevant to my current self. Things I did in college, that's probably somebody else. And anytime I form opinions, I do so after reasonable weighing of the rational evidence in favor of my position. Now that's a different story. You are basically selfish, obtuse, and stupid. And therefore, when you succeed, it was probably luck. If you fail, that was probably your fault. You're responsible not only for your current actions, but your past actions and actions of anyone else I see as like you, even maybe ones that occurred thousands of miles away or hundreds of years in the past. You form your opinions based on your pre-existing ideology and commitments, and as a consequence, if I need to change your mind, you can be persuaded only by direct threats. This may remind you of some of the recent political dialogue. Okay, so that is a basic human structure of thinking. That's the attribution error that we come ready to impose on any interaction with anybody else that we see as different from ourselves. This is not specific to any culture or any context. It's not specific to race or gender. We're prepared to see these flaws in any other person or group at pretty much the drop of a hat. And so what psychology suggests is that human psychology is profoundly ready to divide the world into us and them. Group divisions, far from needing decades of experience, are easy to create, are profoundly poisoned by the perception of any zero-sum good, especially symbolic goods. The sense that your success or status has to come at the cost of mine leads to poisoning of every part of our relationship. And once those divisions are created, the consequence is deep and deepening mistrust and miscommunication, as each of us bring our negative expectations of one another into every subsequent ambiguous interaction. That's a pretty negative viewpoint. And so the question becomes, this event is not only about providing a vocabulary to describe where we're coming from, it's about charting a path into a future. And so the question I think that this poses is, if the way that we interact with one another profoundly reflects our expectations of one another, what could an art museum do to raise our expectations of one another? And I think that's the kind of conversation that's going on here, is what is the role of institutions in raising expectations for the ways that a civic society functions? As Chris said, one important thing to note here is that it's definitely not enough to have good intentions, to say these words to one another. Talking doesn't always work. And it's easy for positive intentions to sour, and for feelings of betrayal to deeply undermine initial good steps and good works. Science has also been used to study that part of the process, how things go wrong in spite of good intentions, and gives us a fair warning of when that kind of thing is most likely to happen. And so I just want to bring some of those warnings also into this conversation. One way that positive intentions go badly is when everybody comes to the conversation too worried about how the other group sees them. So this is actually not about being biased against the other group, but about fearing the bias the other group has towards you. This has been studied between many different groups, but in particular in Canada, where I'm from, it's studied in terms of interactions between white Canadians and Aboriginal Canadians, where before an interaction, each group is so full of the fear of how the other group is going to see them. The Aboriginals fearing to be stereotyped, the white Canadians fearing that they will be blamed for the history of abuse and marginalization, that even before the interaction, it's already failed. And so one piece of scientific vocabulary that I think helps shed light on that is this idea of meta-perception or meta-bias, not just the bias you have of another group, but the fear and anxiety of being treated with bias by that other group. The other major way in which science has revealed that these positive intentions go wrong is that mostly people design programs, next steps, looking at the needs of the group that's in power. And in general, the group that's in power in any situation is comfortable that they're receiving the respect that they want, that they're viewed as competent, that they have autonomy. And so what they need from a difficult situation is to be liked. And they go into situations of conflict wanting to organize joint activities. Let's go out for a pint. Let's eat falafel together. Let's do a climbing activity and roast things on a fire. And if that happens, then the dominant group's need has been met. Now they feel like we're all so likable. Whereas groups, and this is true of individuals, many of us will have experienced this in private interactions too, if you've been disempowered, historically or even just recently for a while, then your primary concern is not whether or not you like that other person, it's whether you're being heard by that other person. And being heard here doesn't just mean I talk and you're in the room, right? Being heard means that the things that I say and the ways that I say them change the way you respond to me, that you are able to incorporate my perspective and my narrative in the next thing you say and do. And it's less often that people coming from a position of power recognize and are ready to create context for conversation where both of those kinds of needs are being met. So what's next? I think that it's an exciting idea for an art museum to propose to be the context where we can raise our expectations of one another, where we can have hard conversations, where art and the encyclopedic collections and other perspectives can come together to create a dialogue over what's otherwise a hard and political problem. And I think it's curious and courageous and a little odd that they thought a scientific vocabulary might also have a role to play in there. But I hope that it would, for some people, play the kind of role that it plays for me personally. So confronting hard problems in society, for me, I find can be helped by taking this kind of formal external perspective on my mind and on the ways that I interact with people. Instead of just relying on my good intentions, to try to take a look from the outside at the observable consequences of my actions and how they're seen from other perspectives. And in particular, from this sort of formal, unforgiving, quantitative perspective that science gives. I think that is a provocation to humility, this idea of us each as being just an example of the human experience. And I think it's also an alternative to the defensiveness, which is often created as we confront hard problems in our society. So, with that, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Rebecca. I will make sure that I do say great things about her before she leaves the stage. Our next speaker is Ibrahim Rasool, a close friend, the former South Africa ambassador to the United States. But what gives him the most, I think, sort of credibility to be here is he's truly one of the most courageous, thoughtful, see, I'm doing for Ibrahim what I could have done for you, people to come out of South Africa in the last 50 years. Ibrahim was one of the leading activists at the African National Congress under apartheid, went to prison, spent some time in prison with Nelson Mandela, came out, was deeply involved in the transition and the negotiations, served in Parliament, ran and was elected as governor of the Western Cape, which is Cape Town, and then became ambassador to the United States, and went back to South Africa to try to rebuild the moral credibility of his country. Something that we need here, which is why he flew 30 hours to be here. So with that, I want to bring Ibrahim. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. And after such an introduction, I can only say that Rebecca missed out the full warmth of what Tim can do for you. It can even overcome any sense of jet lag when Tim creates the expectation that you will speak. But I really want to say that the Baltimore Museum of Art, under the leadership of its board, its direction of its donors, and Chris Bradford as its CEO, I think is really taking a very brave step here today to convene a conversation of this nature, because you never know where it could go. And that's the important point, I think, that happens when an institution, a society, a nation, a world is in transition. And I think that this is a transitional moment, not only in the world, but certainly in the USA. Certainly it continues in South Africa. And I think that maybe even for an institution like the BMA. And if you understand it to be a moment of transition, then you brace yourselves and you prepare for what a transition may or may not throw up. And that, I think, is where we are. I've had the absolute, looking back, privilege of having lived through South Africa's transition from an apartheid society to a democracy. I think that it was a transition that seemed as if it just didn't want to come. And then when it came with such a rapidity, such a speed, and such a force that you often wondered, how can you slow it down? And then when the transition reaches its critical moment, you understand that a national transition in South Africa from apartheid to democracy was occurring within a broader global transition from a bipolar world. The Soviet Union had collapsed. There were no options of communism or any other ism that you could choose from. The a la carte had become a very set and narrow buffet. And so you were within a transition, but also being driven by a global transition. And so I remember the day that Nelson Mandela was released from prison, and he stood on the steps of the City Hall and said, we shall nationalize the mines, and we shall nationalize the farms, and nationalize the factories. And afterwards we had to tell him, Madiba, the world had changed. And so it was a transition of our own expectations, of our own ideological assumptions that we also needed to go through. Looking back, it is said that in the negotiating period in South Africa, more people died in that half a decade than in the struggle as a whole. That's how dangerous that transition was. That was the moment when vacuums open up in society and people are not sure who's leading that society, that paramilitaries, vigilante groups, murderous groups emerge in society to try and influence the way in which that society would go forward. And so this was what it was that we needed to go to. And then in those kind of transitions, human beings need to hold on to a vision. And we were exceptionally fortunate that Nelson Mandela's generation in the 1950s already had articulated for us a vision that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. That was absolutely revolutionary and counter-instinctive to say when apartheid had just been elected and given institutional form, when the law books had such meticulous detail about what apartheid was and how blacks and whites could not mix and how groups within black communities could not marry and where you could live and what you could learn and what your life expectations could be and who would have health and who would not have health. That was the detail of apartheid. And in the midst of that comes the Freedom Charter, the document that guided the ANC. And it says, South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. And it was that essential vision that held us human despite all the temptations to be dehumanized, that kept us non-racial when we wanted to respond to racism with a counter-racism. And so, if there's anything that's going to keep us going in a transition, it is to have a vision, to imagine yourselves in the future, to imagine a better you, a better institution, a better country, to find the words for it, and to galvanize people around it. And when we said to ourselves again in the 1980s, and when the negotiations were in earnest in the 1990s, we said to ourselves, South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. There was a fundamental understanding that underpinned it, that the other is here to stay. So many of us harbor the idea that the other is temporary, that the other can go, that we can scare the other away, that we can wish the other away, that if we made life uncomfortable for the other, they would leave. But the moment we understood that our white community had no other place to go, like the Portuguese in Mozambique and the British in this place and the Spanish in that place, they were here to stay. Our mind started to adapt to the idea we needed to coexist with them. And if we are going to look each other in the eye into the future, we'd better get to know each other. And so a series of encounters to demonize ourselves to the other and to demonize the other for ourselves. Put differently, to humanize ourselves, to switch our ideological lens off and to switch our human lens on, became absolutely critical, because all those ideological filters and lenses make us see people as categories, and it makes us blind to their humanness. And so the moment we understood the essential humanity of the other, we knew we needed to go forward. And then we were fortunate that we had a philosophy of life in South Africa called Ubuntu, which, if you listen to Nelson Mandela, he simply says, we are people through other people, as the meaning of the word Ubuntu. And when you listen to Desmond Tutu, who's a preacher and uses a few more words, it says that we realize our own humanity when we recognize the humanity in others, meaning that human beings are interdependent. And so it was on that moment, it wasn't about whether we were going to be together in the future. It was how do we get there with a minimum amount of damage to our own humanity, and when we take up the responsibility to restore the humanity of even those who have the power in society, economic, military, and others. Because it takes an exceptional amount of dehumanization by a perpetrator to perpetrate what they've perpetrated against us. And therefore, we have the moral obligation to humanize the other as the precondition for a good coexistence. And I think that that is the challenge that we faced in 1994. And so we understood then what our tasks were. And for me, the tasks crystallized when I read Antonio Gramsci, who described transitions as the most dangerous period in the life of a nation, because he says, the old has not yet died and the new has not yet been born. That's what makes transitions uncomfortable, the coexistence of the old and the new. And we understood our task in that transition, therefore, to be the undertakers of the worst of the old. Not everything in the old is bad. The art is to sift it out, to see what can be carried forward in one form or another with new values, new meanings, new interpretations, with new relevance. And only the worst aspects of the old must go to the undertaker. But we also need to be the midwives of the best of the new, because not everything that comes to you and parades as the new is necessarily best for you. It is again to sift through it and to find that coexistence between the old and the new that is able to carry us forward in this transition. And so we needed to confront that. And I wanted to say that it is both a backward-looking process in which the rear-view mirror is important, but more importantly is the forward-looking one in which the windscreen becomes absolutely crucial. We needed to look in that rear-view mirror because terrible things were done over 350 years. There was slavery, there was genocide, there were bloody wars, there was dispossession, there was dehumanization, torture, and all of those kind of things. And we needed a formula to discuss it, a safe place. And that's where the Truth and Reconciliation Commission became absolutely crucial. We knew that we couldn't do the Nuremberg-style things with absolute justice because we needed to look each other in the eye. There was no magical Israel for the whites. We would coexist in one place, and therefore absolute litigious, legalistic justice was not on the table. And therefore, we needed to find a formula in which the truth could be told. But in return, we needed to offer people reconciliation, the ability to be good again. And so much of what we do in a transition is to be redemptive, to give people a chance to be good again. And looking forward, we needed to imagine ourselves differently into the future. And for us, that imagination into the future was a combination of being able to find a new proportion of unity and diversity. Because too much unity, we understood, leads us down the road of assimilation, to become the same, and nothing about us could be the same or desired to be the same. We needed those points where we were different. So we wanted the right to be the same in one nation, but also the right to be different. And therefore, assimilation was not on the cards, to become the same. But we also didn't want too much diversity, because too much diversity creates an atomization, a communitarianism, where we just coexist in different neighborhoods, oblivious to the other. And so the point that I think we found was that we needed a formula of sufficient unity, sufficient diversity, and integration was the answer for us, where we recognized that the integrity of the whole to be a new nation was dependent on the whole restoring and recognizing the integrity of its parts. And it's the balance of those integrities that creates that basis. And so, to end, I think what we want to offer from a South African perspective is that those kind of debates become absolutely crucial within a community like Baltimore, historically complex and particularly fraught with danger, particularly after Freddie Gray and other incidences that have happened. And I think that the best ally in this is thoughtfulness, not reflexiveness. The best arbiter of this could be a BMA, in which there is a safe space free of political talk, and in which human beings can restore each other's humanity and be redemptive in the process. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. And since we have a long panel, I'll go right to the next speaker, which is Jeannie Howe, who is the Executive Director of the Greater Baltimore Cultural Alliance. She's extraordinary. I've gotten to know her in the last couple of months, and I knew that we had to have her, followed by Kibibi afterwards, speak. So please come, Jeannie.
Thank you so much, Tim, and thank you, Chris, for inviting us to be here and for this conversation. I am going to try to stay on point and on my notes, but my mind is sort of being blown every minute here. You guys are amazing. I was lucky enough to be here for some of the conversation this morning, and I just want to say, Rebecca, you totally belong in the museum. Scientists are... I think this should be your second home or first home. Liz Lerman, who's also a fabulous artist, dancer, MacArthur Genius Award winner, likens the work of artists to scientists and their whole process of discovery. So you're our people. Thank you all for being here. Greater Baltimore Cultural Alliance works to support cohesion in the artistic and cultural community, and of course that spills out over into the greater community as well. Our community of artists, of organizations, we cover history, heritage, universities and colleges, artists, art museums, performing arts spaces, but really we are all about creating sort of a glue that helps us to work more efficiently together, more robustly, more meaningfully, and of course a really important part of that is our work in equity and inclusion. It's really part of our DNA and who we are. And our other priorities are around advocacy and also sectors of the service, which includes marketing and developing audiences, funding artists, doing a variety of different things. But we do work hard to try to keep a lens of equity and inclusion in all of the things that we do, although it's important enough that it's called out specifically as one of our priorities. This evening, I just wanted to touch on two things. It's going to be hard to stay focused because there is so much, but I wanted to talk a little bit about a particular part of GBCA's response to the Baltimore uprising, maybe as it relates to some of the things we're talking about, and then also to talk about our relationships with cultural organizations relative to our Urban Arts Leadership Program, which is a program which supports the careers of aspiring arts administrators of color. My colleague Kibibi Ajanku is going to be talking much more specifically about that, but I wanted to talk a little bit about our philosophy and our approach to that work, and I think you'll hear a lot of commonality in our approach and our feeling about that particular work and what's going on within cultural institutions to some of the things that have been said tonight. But first I wanted to give you a little context, and I think those of you from Baltimore will know much of this. I hope I know how to do this. Slide change. We have an incredibly diverse cultural ecosystem from these large, fabulous institutions like the Baltimore Museum of Art and the Walters Art Museum. We have a lot of mid-sized organizations. We have incredible variety of performing arts organizations. We also have a huge and rich and very deep and historic cultural life and activity that happens in the broader community that's often not recognized, not valued, and certainly is not invested in. And so we see this as part of the whole personality of Baltimore, and also part of what we really have to be responding to. This picture, I think a lot of you will have seen already who are from Baltimore, is actually post-uprising and the ways in which the artists in our community were really called to respond. A couple of musicians from the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra decided that they wanted to do a free concert outside the concert hall and just invite anybody who wanted to come. That was the way of expressing unity. So they mentioned this idea, and it swelled and it grew, and it became a huge number of the musicians as well as the maestro. And as you can see, there was quite a crowd that was drawn. The point I wanted to make about Baltimore's history within this context is, for those of you who live here, you might have seen this map before. This is a map of the population of Baltimore. And the blue parts, this is all a race division. And the blue parts are all African American, and the pink parts are the white population. And in our community, this has become known as I'm not sure who first coined this, as the black butterfly and the white L of privilege. And if you put this map up against any other demographic information, what you'll discover is that a great deal of what's happened in Baltimore reflects the same composition. Now I'm going to take the water. So, for example, this is the demographic map of poverty rates in Baltimore. And I think you can see very vividly the way that that mirrors the same population layout. So the point I wanted to make about this, which is made by many others prior, including Antero Putela in his book, Not in My Neighborhood, which is a really excellent source of information about housing discrimination. And it turns out that actually Baltimore was the architect of redlining, and that it was so deeply ingrained, it just as Ibrahim was talking, and as we talked at lunch, it was our own special kind of apartheid in that it was really embedded into the codes and regulations and laws of our city. And we created that here, and the legacy of that is a lot of the same kind of distribution of wealth, the distribution of poverty, illness, life expectancy, and a whole variety of things. What that sort of serious and brutal exclusion bred were a lot of the things that we saw at the time of the uprising. And a lot of the response to the uprising and the artists who were called really came from artists in the community. So what we found were that the immediate response from the artists and from the community itself was to get the artists out on the street, to really take a look at what was going on, to really inspire people and unite people. And I put up this picture because the part that I wanted to tell you about GBCA's response was we got a couple of calls, and one was, we have some money that we'd like to help with, but we don't know what to do, which was really a frequent question that we received and a lot of people received. Because so many people wanted to respond, but they weren't connected in a way that allowed them to know sort of what their next steps were. So what we did was, in partnership with the Maryland State Arts Council and Baltimore Office of Promotion of the Arts, is we created a mini grants program pretty immediately. And there were a couple of different aspects to it. There wasn't a lot of money, and that was a little disappointing. But the grants that we were able to award were $500 each. But what we were able to do was to create a program for access to those grants that had nothing to do with really deep process. You didn't have to fill out a major application. You could write your application on the one page in handwriting. You could fax it to us. You could drop it by our office, which actually ended up being a really important message that we sent to the community. We found the right people to send the messages out, and we got great response. And we got great response from people we never had heard of before. From those folks who've been operating the community for years, who were invisible, who were doing writing programs with adolescent girls to help them take control of the narratives of their life. They were doing these incredible programs with marching bands, which, if you're not from Baltimore, are a really big thing here outside of the institution of schools. They were doing murals. We saw a lot of murals, but they were doing them around identity projects. And these were all really, really important activities. And $500, although very small, meant a lot. So one of the purposes of doing this way was to say we wanted the money to get out really, really fast. We wanted people to know that they had access to it. And it really wasn't for larger organizations or even for institutions. You didn't have to be a 501c3. You could be an artist. You could be a cafe that hired artists. And we had to actually turn down a couple of people who were our friends. And we didn't make them very happy, but it was only $500. And it really wasn't for them. You know, it was really to try to create this. But the other goals of it were that we wanted to find out more about the folks who were doing the kind of really important work that was already happening in the community. We wanted to know more about them. We wanted to have an opportunity to respect them, to recognize them. So after we did the first round of funding, we did a press release. So we called out the organizations, and so we wanted other folks to know about them. We made sure that the counselors from the Maryland State Arts Council knew when there were events that they could go to so that they could learn about them. There were probably almost all organizations that were not being funded by the Arts Council, and might never be, but was really important for people to get energized around that. So it was the money, it was the recognition, and it was the opportunity for us as an organization to develop more relationships of respect and more understanding, and to create networks. So I just wanted to sort of let you know about that, and we did fund those writing programs for adolescent girls, and we did fund a marching band so that they could buy uniforms, because they were taking their kids down to Florida, and they needed something to be able to wear. They had everything else all figured out, but they had an opportunity to take kids from Baltimore City and their marching band down to Florida. So they were small, and we followed up with those folks. They've become sort of a part of our family in some cases not. But it really gave us a chance to connect. The other thing that I wanted to just talk to you about, this is a really joyous thing, and these were the kind of pictures you weren't seeing on the news, right? Those of us from Baltimore. This was not the narrative that the world was seeing. mostly saw the burning iconic CVS, but nobody was making mention of the fact that right across the street was the Pratt Library branch that stayed open all throughout this whole event, opened itself up for the community. They knew, they understood, and the wonderful folks who are on staff at the library, how important they were as a resource. And so they stayed, and they wanted to be there for folks. And I think they had always been, they didn't just start behaving that way when this happened. They were an authentic part of that community already. So the other story I wanted to just tell you about real quickly was relative to, and I think this might relate a lot to what other folks are doing, is our Urban Arts Leadership Program. This fellowship gives young people an opportunity for some training like anybody needs coming out of college, hard and soft skills, and fills in for some of the lacks like networks and champions within organizations. But there's a lot of these kind of programs around the country. There's a lot of really talented young people who are looking for ways to enter the cultural field. And yet our organizations, not only in leadership, but also within their staffing, do not represent the populations of the country. We talk about a majority-minority country, and it's certainly not the case. We did mention that Baltimore is 65 to 70% African-American. It's certainly not the case here that we really see the diversity of the city reflected in the staff composition. And again, as others have said, this is not because of some devious and ill intent. There are people of really great intentions. And in fact, in the arts community, I think we have one of the greatest opportunities because you have people with open hearts, and we're working in a world that really is about exploring who we are in terms of our humanity. So there really is an opportunity to create change, but for heaven's sake, as we've said in some of the other fields, we've done 30, 40, 50 years of trying this. I was on a panel with some other folks, and they said, yeah, we were fighting this fight in the 60s. We didn't think we'd still have to be fighting it now. But here we are, and the change hasn't happened. So you have to ask yourself what's not happening in this process. A lot of folks have tried pipeline programs, and there's a lot of really important work there. But what we really thought about in the creation of this program with David Mitchell, and Kibibi was actually involved in the whole early part of the development of the program, which is community-based. It really came out of conversations with the community, was that we couldn't deal with just the pipeline, that we had to look at what was happening within the organizations. We had to prepare young people to enter organizations where they were going to be the only person of color, or maybe the one of very few. And we had to challenge the organizations, and I say this, we did this in a subversive way to start, because we really didn't know how it would be received. And we didn't know, I love that discussion about being able to approach this without shame and having a way in. We wanted to find a way in with folks to be able to start this discussion so we could then promote further use of techniques and of training. So what we did was we started working with Baltimore Racial Justice Action, and specifically Avis Ransom, and we incorporated equity and inclusion training into the program for the fellows, but we also required that the organizations who were hosting the fellows for their professional job placement over a period of 6 months, 20 hours a week, that they too would participate in that training. And that they would now, it's now been expanded, that they would on a regular basis talk about this. Some of our organizations, like Everyman Theater, went on to adopt training of their own, to explore it. That was sort of our dream, that it would continue beyond. We're looking at ways that we can not only inspire that, but help to make it happen. Because as Rebecca said earlier today, people are, not only do they have good intentions, but they're working very, very hard. Nobody has a lot of money in any of these organizations, even the big ones, which might be a surprise to some people. But how do you fit this in? And I think the way you fit it in is that you have to be intentional. You have to decide that it's a priority. It has to be the way that you look at the world. And then you have to give people a way to move through that. And I think the last and most challenging thing about that is that we are a really impatient people. And when you're smart, you want a list of things to tell you how to get it done, right? And so, this isn't a kind of thing where we walk into an organization and say, after one training, here's your list, you got it, Rooney's rules, you do this, you do that, and you're good. This is, as Tim was saying, generational work. This is, for institutions, it's generational work as well. But we think there's some real promise in this, and we feel like we're a bit of a laboratory. For me personally, it's been a personal and professional journey. I grew up very fortunately in a what some people call the People's Republic of Tacoma Park. And I lived in a world where, there were the Syrians across the street, the Puerto Ricans next door, the Germans on the other side, several Jewish families, a Baptist family that ran a church out of their house, and several black families. I mean, I thought that's the way you grew up. But so I'm really lucky in that way. But, I don't pretend to think that I'm fixed either. This is a real personal journey, I think, for all of us as we go through this. And I love also what Rebecca said about a provocation to humility. Because every time I forget, and I think we're moving along, it's not even conscious, something happens and you go, oh my God, I didn't even see how that was coming together. So the progress that I see is that I'm starting to notice a little bit more once you're in a leadership position and you're in a place where you can make decisions and people want to move fast. So I love the idea of the call to humility and patience with yourself and with others, and really expecting that one another has the best intentions. So I'm pleased to speak with you this evening. I was going to do one more. Let's see, this is not quite true. One of the murals in Baltimore, which says if you can't read it, looks much better now. So we're hoping someday we can say that even more. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeannie. And we're going to go right next to Kibibi Ajanku, who is the head of equity and inclusion at the Greater Baltimore Cultural Alliance. She wears many hats. She's an incredible artist. I had the honor of meeting her about a month ago when we became fast friends, and I'm thrilled that you're here tonight.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you very much. I might need a little tech support so that I can click. Look at that, magic. All right, so thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you very much, Chris. I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to jump right in, and in a very uncharacteristic way, I've kind of scripted myself, if you don't mind. So I'll have eyes up and eyes down, but I'm here loving you nevertheless. I, too, am from the Greater Baltimore Cultural Alliance, and my responsibility is Director of Equity and Inclusion. Such a fashionable word these days. So, I ask, what is the healing? How do we get beyond conflict? Does Baltimore need rituals conjured from the past to meet the needs of the troubled present? That's a quote by Ta-Nehisi Coates from Baltimore. We love him, yes? When nonviolence begins halfway through the war with the aggressor calling time out, it exposes itself as a ruse. Now, that is also a quote by Ta-Nehisi Coates, Baltimore born. Well, this is the thing. I am here because I believe that there is the hopeful and majestic possibility of a vision beyond conflict. Equity and inclusion are listed among the core values of the Greater Baltimore Cultural Alliance, and this evening I use that as a lens to focus on restorative relief for the historic juxtaposition between the continuing and conflicting concepts of the haves and the have-nots that exist in the urban environment. And furthermore, I narrow the scope to speak to a nuanced understanding and an examination of the arts sector in this city. I was born in Baltimore, raised in Baltimore, I work in Baltimore, I play in Baltimore, and I know the very fiber of this city, the thrust of the communities within it as well. I present tonight as a healing and honoring of the anniversary of the Baltimore uprising that took place in the spring of 2015. I am here because I believe that there is the hopeful and majestic possibility of a vision beyond conflict. I don't think I can say that enough times. Oh, Baltimore, man, it's hard just to live. The words of Nina Simone in her 1978 song. 400 years ago, chattel slavery prevailed in America, and Maryland was a slave state. During that time, Baltimore was a major port city teeming with vibrant economic possibility. And while slave holdings were the standard, complete with every bit of the historic atrocity, within the city and at the same time lived the largest population of free people of color on record in this very United States of America. The juxtaposition is mind-boggling, and the opposing concepts seem absolutely unrealistic. So now, flash forward to current times. Baltimore never really figured out how to deal with the painful legacy of its past. And this, regrettably, is evidenced by the continuing contrast. With a closer look, one can see a city where trailblazing, conceptual, economic, and thought leadership seem to be limitless for all. But at the same time, many are totally left out of that canon of possibility and locked into an inheritance of the invisible margin where lack, hopelessness, and anger are rampant. No culture can live if it attempts to be exclusive. That's Mahatma Gandhi. Justice will not be served until those who are not affected are as outraged as those who are. That's Ben Franklin. But somehow we have missed the memo over and over again. Angry? Who will cast the blame? Hostile? Who will reign in judgment? Frustrated? Who will witness? And so the marginalized, the invisible, the underserved rise up from an ongoing simmer to a full-out boil over, with injustice as the catalyst. History does repeat itself. Many images from the Baltimore uprising in 2015 look strangely, or maybe not so strangely, similar to the images for the 1968 riots following the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The response from the art community was organic, organized, and orchestrated. The Baltimore Center Stage sang One Love from its musical Marley to Rise Up in Peace. Morgan State University created temporary mural art with a monumental message. Neighborhood marching bands took to the streets. Capoeira, Brazilian martial arts masters, showcased artistic violence prevention techniques. Musicians gathered to sing for peace. The Akimbo Youth Group presented the real face of Baltimore teens. And sidewalk crafts were led by artists and university students for the children of the protesters. It was a conscientious response, organic, organized, and orchestrated, all coming together to create this conscientious response. I believe in art as a tool for activism. It is a most effective and creative device for social justice. In truth, we are all members of one gigantic global village, and we are a community. It is an unavoidable reality that we do actually need each other. Art is the perfect conduit to strengthen the exploration of universal civic value, increased group involvement, and improved communal engagement. We can use art as a platform to shine a light on the nuances of identity that continually plague us as human beings. We are frail and fearful and always worried about differences. This shows up in everything from our politics to our day-to-day treatment of each other. But by using art as a pathway, we can find a place where resistance melts into a spirit of openness and acceptance, a place where understanding and empathy thrive, a place where positive working relationships form because there is a power to imagine productivity, a place where there is the influence to manifest a vision, a place where there is the courage to dream big and a willingness to share universally, and so a place where radical experimentation and deep communication can happen. The year 2040 marks the start of a decade when people of color will be the majority in the United States. Black and Latinx people will make up nearly 40% of the US population, yet the economic indicators for these communities are poor and have not shown much sign of improving. If we're going to be a majority-minority country, we must figure out how to empower our communities of color. That's a quote from a company called Code 2040. And then Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King says an individual, or said that an individual has not started living until he can rise above the narrow confines of his individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity. I stand at the helm of the Urban Arts Leadership Program for the Greater Baltimore Cultural Alliance. This is our primary vessel and tool to address a vast and most essential and very urgent need for equality, equity, inclusion in this city and beyond. The need is not new, and this program existed before the Baltimore uprising of 2015. The work of the Urban Arts Leadership Program is not angry or aggressive, nor is it melancholy or sad. It is hopeful and celebratory as a majestic and royal corridor to a place of peace and possibility for all, inclusively. I thank you.
Thank you, Kibibi. Now, our next speaker is Carrie Mae Weems. And I was going to say, Carrie, you have a tough act to follow, but I know you'll be good. I think you probably know, Carrie Mae is one of the great artists working today in the United States and the world. She is in most of the major museums. Her work is about real, not only social engagement and social action, but how do we redefine the human experience here in the United States. And I'm proud to call her a friend. And she has many other accolades, but I would rather you start. So thank you, Carrie Mae.
Thank you so much. And to this illustrious panel, what a great and amazing group of people. I'm really honored to share the day and the stage with you all. And Tim and I met in Powder Mountain maybe a year and a half ago. We were a young group of young men are thinking about constructing a new city. And that's where we met with Jeff Chang, who I think is really an extraordinary man who runs the Diversity Institute at Stanford University. So what I thought I would do is to share with you a small piece that I made maybe about a year ago. And it started really as a project that I wanted to make for Barack Obama. I wanted to send him a thank you gift from about 50 artists to say thank you for your service to the nation. And I imagined that I would have lots of music and various compositions and wonderful illustrations and small paintings and photographs and all of these things. And I kind of dreamt it. And I rolled out of bed one morning because my husband wasn't there and I could smoke in bed. And I grabbed my computer and I wrote about 25 artists, asking them if they would participate with me in this project, this thank you to the president. All kinds of artists from various backgrounds, ethnicities, and so forth. And by the end of the day, it was a Saturday morning, by the end of the evening, probably at least 20 people had written me back to say yes. And then by the end of the weekend, maybe 30, 35 people had written back to say yes, that they would participate with me. And so what happened suddenly was that this thing that I thought was going to be a series of boxes and gifts turned into actually a performance. That I realized that that I was starting to work with a set of musicians that I really admired and appreciated and wanted to work with. I love working with musicians, actually. And that I wanted to work with dancers and certain poets. Anyway, suddenly I realized that I had a performance on my hands, and it was presented, it was called Grace Notes Reflections for Now, and presented at the Spoleto Festival last year, and then at Yale University Theater in the fall, and now it's going to the Kennedy Center actually in October. So I'm really happy about that. But the work I think is difficult. The work that Chris is attempting to do here at the museum is a difficult project. The work that Himrim is doing in South Africa is a difficult project. Beyond Conflict is a difficult project. And I think that there's something important about really understanding the task that really is at hand, and the extraordinary effort that it takes to do this kind of work, and the extraordinary commitment that it takes to do this kind of work, and a sense of purpose and meaning in your life that it takes to really do this kind of work. And I don't think that really people engage this work. I know that I don't. I know that I don't because I want to. I'm really compelled to. I feel like I have no other option, that, that I have an opportunity in my life to figure out some ways of making a difference in my life for the people that I care about in my life. And those are many, 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 many different kinds of people. I think that the call is always greater than yourself. It includes you. I don't do that without selfishness, but it is absolutely for the purpose of having a sense of our shared greater humanity. The thing that I love most about my father, who was like an extraordinary storyteller, was that when I was a child, and the strongest thing that I remember about him was his endlessly picking me up and setting me on his lap and looking me in the face and saying, "Carrie, I want you to remember that there is no person, no man greater than you. But always remember, you are no greater than any other, that we are all equal. And remember that you have a right to be, that you have a right to voice, that you have a right to speak, that you have a right to participate in the world." It was the greatest lesson that my father instilled in me, and that I hope that I can carry forward. It's a long, long task. Some of the images will be difficult to see, and I'm sorry about that. Inclusion is a process, a discovery, a set of ideas, a concept. An idea, an agreement, a belief, and a practice. A current trend and a political concern. An opinion, a way of life, a set of relationships, partnerships. A dream for some, a problem for many. A metaphor, a state of mind, a mind game, a position, a call to action, a will to power, a set of determinations, sometimes a word that is written but is little understood. What is it? I think of it at times as a willingness on the part of two or more people from different places and different groups who come to an agreement that they will be occupying the same space for the same time, perhaps for the same reason, for the purpose of engaging with one another, perhaps for the greater good, for social justice. I ask myself often, how do you measure a life? How do you measure a life? How do you measure a life? These people were no strangers to sorrow. And time again, the man was rejected and the woman was denied. A man was killed. The body lay in the open, uncovered and exposed. Women wailed and men moaned. For reasons unknown, I saw him running. I saw him stop. I saw him turn with raised hands. I heard a shot. I saw him fall. For reasons unknown, I rejected my own knowledge by refusing to believe that this was even possible. How do you measure a life? The man was rejected. The woman was denied. And the numbers tell the story. He was 25. He was 31. He was 36. She was 28. He was 34. A father, a brother, an uncle, a boy.
He was trying to get out his ID and his wallet out his pocket, and the officer just shot him in his arm. We're waiting for back. I will, sir. No worries. I will. He just shot his arm off.
I told him not to reach for it. I told him to get his hand out.
You told him to get his ID, sir, and his driver's license. Oh my God, please don't tell me he's dead. Please don't tell me my boyfriend just went like that.
Keep your hands where they are, please.
Yes, I will, sir. I'll keep my hands where they are. Please don't tell me this, Lord. Please, Jesus, don't tell me that he's gone. Please don't tell me that he's gone. Please, officer, don't tell me that you just did this to him.
They were no strangers to sorrow. And time again, the man was rejected and the woman was denied. A man was killed. The body lay in the open, uncovered and exposed. Women wailed and men moaned. How do you measure a life? How do you measure a life? commemorating all of the fallen and all of those who have endured, commemorating every black man who lives to see age 21, commemorating Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, commemorating Tamira Rice, Freddie Gray, Sandra Bland, commemorating Christian Taylor, Samuel Du Bois, Walter Scott, commemorating Damian Howard, Thomas Allen, Ezra Ford, commemorating David Felix, Spencer McCain, Darius Stewart, commemorating every black man who lives to see age 21. The man was rejected. The woman was denied. The numbers tell the story. I saw him running. I saw him stop. I saw him turn with raised hands. I heard a shot. I saw him fall. Thank you.
So where do you go from here? This is where we turn to engagement from the audience. And so I guess I would ask if anybody has any questions, observations, something they want to say. We would love to have that happen. We have somebody, in theory, with a mic. And would anybody like to say anything? There has to be at least one person. Let's make it an auction. Do I see two? I know this is a lot to take in. I see a hand over here, so there we go. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How are you? My name is Coley Tengela, and I have the pleasure of honor each and every morning at a Baltimore City public school of teaching a positive social change theater and media program, not too far from the uprising that took the life that was inspired by the death of Freddie Gray. What I want to just share with you is that all of us gathered here today, it's a tremendous experience, beautiful for me. I've been enlightened and informed. But I'm going to go back and share with my students what took place in their families. We do performances in the community, but what I'm so afraid of with all of us here, with all this good intention and love, but there still is that schism of access that those African black folk and Latino folk and poor struggling white folk won't be able and may not even feel comfortable coming in to this museum that's still considered an other to them and non-embracing. So about maybe taking the brilliance of these amazing people and give an opportunity for poor struggling folk of all colors, particularly African black folk, to know that coming into their recreation center with this program and you venturing out and coming into what they have to live and deal with each day will bridge that gap. because we know better, we feel the pain, we intellectually know what needs to be done. But there's folk who are totally and completely artistically, economically, politically disenfranchised. And they have to know, have access to this, as opposed to us who will have access to it and be able to utilize it. When some folk don't even know that good people like us are existing to trying to change things.
Thank you.
So, first of all, thank you for that impassioned and very articulate statement. And you may not know the gift you've given to me, because there are many of our board members in this room, and I credit them greatly for their wisdom and their willingness to turn this corner institutionally with us. So to hear that message from your lips, I think is hugely persuasive to them and helpful to me, so I'm very grateful to you for that. The other thing I want to say is that I think to dovetail with the way I think Tim will develop this conversation, this isn't an exercise in rhetoric at all, or one that seeks to shine a positive light on mere talk. I think what I can promise you is that in the next 1 to 3 years, less, you'll see substantive change at this institution that will pivot around concepts of need and access at the museum. So one tangible thing I can point to is, and I think this will resonate with you, I understand, and I think we all understand, that it's not enough to offer an open invitation to an entirely different community, to a museum that does not feel like home, and has not historically, and probably not for its 100-year history. So that's a difficult thing to say, particularly in a city like Baltimore, where I don't feel we can achieve relevance until we feel like a home to the majority. And that's not the case right now. So we have to take great strides in that direction, and we'll do it within the walls of the institution for sure. We're also going to dedicate, though, a satellite space way beyond the walls of this museum. And it will be in a space and for a community that's never seen this kind of culture before, who may not feel socialized to this kind of engagement, precisely your message. That we acknowledge that it takes tools to have an encounter like this. We also acknowledge that it's important to feel like you're native in this terrain. I was joking this morning and talking to staff and trustees that when I walk into MoMA, even I feel like an alien. And if I feel like an alien, there's a really big problem with the way that museum's orienting itself. If I feel excluded when I walk in there and I feel like there's the possibility of being, cavity searched, that's an issue. So you can only imagine that as a dyed-in-the-wool museum professional, if I have that sensation, what would be the sensation of an average Baltimorean entering this institution? I think that's the mindset we have to have. And I think it's important to go beyond the walls first before we begin to assume that this place feels like home. So I thank you for your comment, and I hope that we can fulfill the promise.
Thank you. Could you just raise your hand? So thank you. It's a community effort to get you that mic. Thank you.
Good evening. This was awesome, first of all. I want to kind of dovetail off of what Coley just said. As you go through the process of developing your programs and your outreach, we as African Americans often talk about access and a seat at the table. I'm curious to know how many folks who look like us have a seat at the table.
So I have many things to say on that front. One is that I was not brought here because we were on the rails and going in the right direction with the right staff and the right program. That was not my incentive to come to the Baltimore Museum of Art. My incentive was to reorient a museum towards a profound change in its identity with a view towards making the city one and of the museum. So had that not been the challenge, I probably wouldn't have come here. I think that the constant invocation of that concept of access can't be overestimated. And I'll try to resist invoking Mark Bradford's name endlessly in this conversation, but he's a preoccupation of mine, obviously. And I believe that the way that he has organized his philanthropy around concepts of need on one hand and access on the other is essentially the logic that we need to take upon ourselves if we're going to change the way we face Baltimore. So that involves a reorientation inside our institution and the reorientation towards the city itself. So I'll say to the board, and it's disapproved of, that if I'm successful in the work that I do here in the next, let's say 3 to 5 years, the next director of the Baltimore Museum won't look like me. So I would say it's a radical aspiration, and one that I think that the board and the staff embrace. I think that it's shocking to realize that in our evolution as cultural institutions, we're actually many steps behind organizations like the NFL, even. We don't have our own Rooney Rule. We have nothing like that. In fact, I'm not even sure we've had a principle of inclusion guiding our hiring practices up until this point. Only now are those concepts and ideas beginning to take root. So you inherit one structure, and then you try to imagine another, and then imagine that structure beyond yourself. And I think that's the process that we're involved in. But I would say that we don't reflect the world that you want to see reflected right now.
Chris is hard of hearing, so if you...
I was surprised that mentioning the museums in Baltimore, you didn't mention AVAM, the American Visionary Art Museum. But I was also thinking, just off the top of my head, that the Creative Alliance downtown, which has been very inclusive, and it's now celebrating, I think its 25th anniversary, and AVAM might be wonderful partners in this idea of satellite spots where you all could trade rooms and get more people together that way. That's all.
Thank you. Oops.
Hi, my name is Janelle, and I am a journalist. I've done radio and print for many years. I got my start in print at the Columbus Call-and-Post newspaper, which is Ohio's oldest Black weekly newspaper. And then I started my own publication called The Conscious Voice, which was a diversity voice for art and culture when I first had the chance to meet Christopher Bedford at the Wexner Center for the Arts in 2010 during Mark Bradford's museum survey. And so what I wanted to talk about is the aspect of diversity and inclusion from another aspect. We know that the aspect is there as far as being accepted and, feeling welcome at a museum. But the part that I have encountered is with the advertising dollars that are spent. And what I would find with my publication, it reached a diversity audience, is that the art museum would have an exhibition featuring 30 Black artists during Black History Month, and they would spend 100% of their advertising dollars in general market publications. And so it became very clear to me very quickly that art museums were not interested in my audience. And so I am just overjoyed that this is happening at BMA. I'm just excited that you all are addressing this. And I just wanted to speak to the issue of the advertising dollars and how they're spent.
Thank you. The woman right behind. I should just point out the obvious. Chris, this is now on record.
Yep.
And it's all...
So I'll answer just very, very quickly through anecdote. I think it's a really good point. I hope all the people in the marketing and PR department at the BMA here listening to your sage advice. I am deeply involved with Mark and his work still, and actually just opened an exhibition at his not-for-profit space in Los Angeles, which is called Art and Practice. And one of the many things I've learned working in South Central LA and in that space is that the way we advertise and speak is completely ineffective at reaching certain communities. So what I learned from Mark and others involved is that print advertising is still incredibly valuable, that the internet is not going to do everything, is not magic, it's not going to achieve everything you want it to achieve, and that really grassroots efforts like taking door hangers and putting them on the doors of the immediate community, are actually the way to tell people, this is for you, it's free, and you should come. And we've strayed really far from those basic ideas, and we imagine, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook as the way to reach people. That's just not the case. If you imagine a different audience, you've got to reach them differently. So, thank you. Your point's well taken.
Let me tell you something very funny. So, I don't know, maybe, like if there's there might be like an article or something about me, like in like the Wall Street Journal or Artform or something like that. But when I have like an article in Jet, that's when the world calls me. It's like, girl, we were sitting up here having dinner and saw your name in Jet. I mean, it was, it's very interesting. I mean, this idea about where things, where money goes, where things are spent, and we were talking about this earlier. Also, these ideas about how work is valued, right? How the work of women is valued, or for that matter, undervalued. How the work of African Americans historically has been, seriously undervalued, and the implications that also has. And what needs to happen in terms of not only, what the role of museums, but the role of art educators and the role of art history and the role of teachers. I mean, it's not just a single institution that's going to make some great change. It is a series of institutions and relationship building and partnerships that really begin to sort of slowly, make some sort of systematic change. And one of the things we were talking about also this morning, it's like, everybody knew that, that major demographics in the country were shifting, right? From, that we would be a majority-minority country. This has been going on for a long time. Financial people have been studying this for years, right? And started talking about it in the very, very, very early 80s, right? So that the museums, not this museum only, but museums around the country, institutions around the country, are now faced with this incredible behemoth that is rising up, right? That there's going to be this incredible, monumental shift in the color of this nation, and how we respond to it is going to be absolutely significant. Currently, the response has been to put this in the White House, right? So the next response is, how do you sort of organize against that?
Okay. If you can follow that, you're a hero. Twice this woman has made it difficult to follow through.
Hi, my name is Elise Mentor. I'm a librarian and I'm semi-new to Baltimore. But my question, well, first I was asked to mention that among Baltimore museums that was not mentioned was also the Reginald Lewis Museum. Yeah. So throw that out there. But then also I wanted to mention, in talking about being a museum for the community and making a difference, being visible, being meaningful, as a cultural heritage professional, I have often observed institutions attempt to do that, but not providing a platform for people from those communities to have a voice. And my question, number one, is how do you plan to tap into the rich cultural arts that already exist and give platforms to people of color who are artists in the area and who are contributing but are not being given opportunity? And then number two, my question is, my second question is, in the library field, we're also having these conversations about how to become more inclusive of the communities that we serve, and also to be more inclusive in terms of the people who we're hiring. How do you, or can you reflect on what it's like in the museum field? Because from my knowledge of the museum field, those are not conversations that are happening more broadly. So as you're interacting with other people in your field, how are you talking about that as an important thing?
So thank you. you've given me 3 gifts, one of which you don't know about, is that I actually have to leave now very shortly to go to Venice to help Mark Bradford with the final stages of his installation there. So I believe in being wholly local and wholly global. Today was the wholly local day, and tomorrow is going to be the very global one. So you've given me the opportunity to say goodbye and thank you to everyone. And also, those 2 points I think are hugely, hugely important. So just briefly, on the subject of Baltimore artists, I think that a blind spot for me historically has been an engagement with the local and an emphasis on the national and global. And coming here, I had a faint sense that that wouldn't necessarily be the case because the level of production here is so high. So I've been very fortunate to have a couple of guides to the city of Baltimore and to understand the quality of contemporary art being produced here. And I will say that there's no question that we will engage in a deep way with local artists, not because it's a simple obligation, but because the quality of production is so uncompromising and aligns with the standards that I've always held museums that I've overseen too. So it's a really, I'm grateful for that, because I think in any other city that level of engagement wouldn't be as feasible as it will be here. So to name just a few, Amy Sherald, extraordinary painter. Paul Rucker, an extraordinary artist whose work is probably beyond my capacity to describe. Stephen Towns, somebody who you may not know as well. But they all play central roles in, I think, the way we engage with the local arts community. And I hesitate even to use that terminology because I think it's simply an art world. They're a part of it, and they happen to live in Baltimore. And then the question of changing the pipeline to the museum, I think it's emerging as a conversation in the museum world. I think that we need substantial leadership, and I think we actually understand the methods for changing the way that museum structures look. So I've been a beneficiary of mentorship throughout the course of my career and people who believed in me and ushered me through the ranks. That's all it is. It's just belief and help. And we just haven't been focusing on perhaps the right people who will advance a different vision of our institution. So we need to expand that mentorship. And it doesn't have to be that formal. It could be as simple as me mentoring a senior at Gilman, a young man of color who wants to enter the museum field as an administrator. So that's true. That's something that I'm doing that we could all do. And it doesn't take an institutional frame or a formal structure to do it. It just takes the kind of advocacy that I enjoyed when I was a young person. So, younger person. Yeah. So those are my answers to your 2 questions, and I hope they're semi-helpful. And I am going to take my leave now and leave you in the good hands of all these people, so thanks.
Chris is also giving a lot of people the opportunity to leave, but I do see hands up. So if we can bring a mic over there.
Good evening. I want to give honor to everyone on the panel and to this whole process, which I think is fabulous. My name is Jill Warzer, and I came to Baltimore 20 years ago to be the fine arts specialist in the city schools. And before everybody leaves, I want to make sure you know that there's only 213 arts teachers for 81,000 children in Baltimore City schools right now. And we need to do something about that. The Baltimore Arts Education Coalition works with many organizations, including people from the Baltimore Museum of Art and individuals, organizations like Greater Baltimore Cultural Alliance, Arts Every Day, Young Audiences, etc. We have a website and a Facebook page, and I encourage you to go on and sign up to work with us to change this disgrace, this cultural disenfranchisement of students that's existed since the late 70s. When I came to Baltimore to be the fine arts specialist in 1997, I found vestiges of excellent programs all over the city. Cabinets of grade 6 orchestra music at Northwestern High School. Kibibi can tell you that there were excellent dance programs and pre-professional craft training programs at Walbrook High School when she went there. And so at one time, Baltimore City had comprehensive and excellent arts education programs. Now, if you cross the county line in any direction, those students have access in every school to at least general and instrumental music, visual art, and some kind of dance and theater. Not here. And we need to change that. That's happened in urban areas, especially all over the United States. And it means that people of color have had a somewhat limited range because of not being nurtured skill-wise to what they've been able to contribute to American culture overall, and it's a huge loss that needs to be corrected.
Thank you.
Thanks.
At the risk of talking to an audience of 3, maybe what I'll do is turn to our panel and ask if anybody would like to say something in response. I was going to have Mark, but Ibrahim, Rebecca, Jeannie, Kibibi? Okay. I'm going to have one more question, and then I'm going to ask Mark Muller from the United Nations. Yes, we have somebody from the United Nations here, so please.
My question is actually directed to Honorable Rasool. Looking at apartheid, and you mentioned that some of the most difficult, or the most difficult time was the transition. I also spent time living in South Africa, have lots of good friends who are born free. And I think that, especially looking at a city like Baltimore, where we are going through a transition, but there's also a very complex relationship that we have with diversity within our own city. What perspective, I guess, can you offer? Because we essentially do have 2 different sectors of our city, or generations versus like sectors of our city, but we have 2 different generations, or maybe perhaps even several generations. One in which that is confronting the realities with a reference to the past, but also this generation that's ahead of us, the youth, that are every day have a new perspective, and perhaps they themselves are either learning about oppression through these experiences, what they've seen on television, what they're experiencing or witnessing, perhaps as children who experience the uprising, but all of these different things that are being introduced within their lives within a fairly short amount of time. How is it that, how did the transition take place? Like, what was the intention in terms of the people of South Africa to be able to give to their children this identity of being born free? In many ways, I would think that, the parents or the grandparents had to be intentional about reaffirming that identity within their children so that they had reverence to what, the movement or the suffrage that, the generation not so far removed had gone through, but also so that they could enjoy the reward of freedom, which meant opportunity, which meant moving forward, which meant giving themselves the opportunity to experience the life that they're born into without all of the weight that they're essentially the weight that affects the former generation in perhaps a different way.
Thank you. Ibrahim?
Thank you very much. I think that the question almost sets a scene for another seminar. But I think that you would know that South Africa is going through quite a bit of turmoil at this moment, or turbulence. And I think that part of that happens because privilege and deprivation are so stark and visible to each other. And it's particularly dangerous in South Africa because it is color-coded. If it had been just a non-racial privilege and a non-racial deprivation, society could manage some of those things, and you could ascribe it to whether you work hard, whether you're educated enough, whether the economy accommodates you, and so forth. But I think that the color-codedness of it begins to say that it is inherited. It is predisposed almost. that something is structurally wrong. I often joke with Palestinians that the two-state solution that we adopted in South Africa is worse than the one projected for Israel-Palestine, because Israel-Palestine is geographical. In our case, blacks took the political state, leaving largely the economic state in the hands of whites, on the presumption that the political state will be the platform, the springboard to economic equity into the future. 23 years later, I think that we have a young generation that you call the born frees, who don't have the same memory of the past that we have, for whom a tap in the house is not such a major thing, for whom a switch for the electricity is not a major thing, and the telephone and the this and the that our parents are eternally grateful for and will continue to vote for the African National Congress for as long as they can open a tap and there's hot water that comes out of it. And so the calibration of memory is a very important one, and the battle for the benchmarking of memory. And the question we're asking ourselves today, were we so relieved that we ended apartheid legislatively, that we were so in a hurry to give our children a sense of mental comfort and to protect them from the trauma of the residues of apartheid, that we may have erased the memory stick that could have told them what life was like before, so that they could temper their expectations and not base their expectations on the benchmark of what they see on the television and read in social media and so forth and so forth. So I think that that's really the kind of battle that we're up against. You need to find how that is applicable to Baltimore. Is your differences color-coded? Is it bequeathed? Is it structural? Is it at least reaching a level of conversation that it is reaching in South Africa, even if the conversation in South Africa reaches levels of touching violence and iconoclasm, throwing down statues of the past and making demands for free this and free that. So I think that you need to understand what that means in Baltimore. I think that that we need to find the balance in South Africa between the reverence for the past, and we've not invested too much in memory. We wanted to pass that era so quickly because it was so horrible that we did not invest sufficient reverence in the minds of the new generation. But we also wanted to do right by them. But we also didn't want to burden them, and I'm going to end on this because we don't want to speak to three people. But the point of the matter is that we wanted to reward them without the wherewithal to reward them. We wanted to assuage them that life could be better, but they didn't share our own sense that just having dignity now, life was already better. And so how do you find the balance between value and values? I think our eagerness to transfer value to them may have been at the expense of transferring values to them. And our desire to shield them from residual suffering may have meant that we diminished the horror of the past with them. So how do you let them understand the horror without burdening them with the horror? And that's the kind of thing, because it can go one of two ways. It can become reverential, and they respect what their parents did, and they time their things well, or it can become extreme. And therefore the final point that I want to make is that we need to prevent it from becoming extreme. But there's a compact that is loosening, the glue is loosening in South Africa, and you've got to watch out for it in Baltimore. that the compact glue loosens when the patience of the poor is not rewarded with the generosity of the rich. When the patience of blacks are not rewarded with generosity of the rich. And I'm not speaking about only philanthropic generosity, but the generosity of recognition. How do we shift from this very fulsome paradigm of kindness to a paradigm of equality with kindness? Because people often think that if you are kind, that it's enough. And they often don't understand how kindness can be almost patronizing. And what confounds white people sometimes in South Africa is that they think they are kind, and they probably are kind. But in a structural system of deprivation, their kindness is patronizing. And so, to end, and so, when I speak about our mission in life being to retain our humanity and to humanize those who do not know better, then that particularly easy to move them to paradigms of equality, so that the kindness is authentic, even though in their own minds it's sincere. So there's a difference between sincere kindness and authentic kindness. And I think we need to struggle around those concepts and to find nuance.
So I would like to just kind of interject there. I do believe that what you were talking about is a really beautiful thing, but the paradigm shifts when you're talking about kindness from a dominant culture perspective. And I think that's where it becomes skewed. And I think that also you cannot really move forward if you cannot connect to past, if you don't understand where you've been. So this kind of forgetting of history creates, what it does is give platform and pathway to cycles that happen over and over again. In this city, we have, as I alluded to in my presentation, I know I went fast and I know it was scripted, but I talked about this juxtaposition from 400 years ago. The same juxtaposition is still in place now. We've got these folk, so many people that have so much in terms of option. People of color, people up, down, over, and under. There are options. But at the same time, you have folk who are caught in the invisible margins. And they will be there for one generation into the next and into the next and into the next. And it can't be about hoping for some kind of dominant culture shift to kindness. It is about an equality that takes place in a real humanity of being courageous enough to look at self, to look at those around us and say, this is fair, this behavior is right. Tim and I have been having some conversations about dominant culture behavior, that just in regard to what we reflexively do. What we reflexively do is say, just like Rebecca talked about, oh my goodness, I want you to like me, so as long as we can kind of hang out and we can talk and we can go, then we're all good. But we have to look beneath the we're all good. We have to look beneath the just kind of positive exchanges that are on the table and really right some wrongs. We're sitting here talking about bringing people in and out of a museum, and maybe what we're really talking about is housing and food. Maybe, maybe that's what we're talking about. Maybe we're talking about, these substantive things, these structures that are in place that allow people the comfort to then say, I want art. We're talking about equity and inclusion, and that's not a small thing. That's not something that's just hit with a Band-Aid. That is the life fabric of our day-to-day existence, and it is work that happens with every breath. It is work that happens with every step. It is work that happens with every relationship. It can never be forgotten, and it is always there. So it is only the humanness in us that will make it forward motion and far-reaching.
I'm cognizant of the time, and unless I'm going to ask Mark Buller, who came from, let me just say quickly, Mark is with the United Nations. He's going to say a couple of quick things. He is currently the special advisor to the UN Special Envoy on Syria. So.
I'm very conscious of time, so I will just end with just a few concluding remarks. I've been honored enough to be invited here to Baltimore by Tim and by Chris. I, as Tim said, am a senior mediator with the United Nations. And I'm here on behalf of the United Nations. And the reason why I'm here is, first of all, we very much respect the type of work that Tim Phillips and Beyond Conflict have been doing for many, many years across many different continents and involving many different countries and communities that have been dealing with difficult change and transition and conflict. And I'm here also because we've heeded the call from Chris Bedford and everything that he is trying to do here with the Baltimore Museum of Art. It is an important initiative at a time of great uncertainty in the world, not just in America, not just in Baltimore, but in Europe and elsewhere. I don't have to describe to you what we are confronting at the moment. And so it is important, I think, that all progressive institutions begin to confront the new reality that we are confronting, a globalized world that is fragmenting, a globalized world which is beginning in some quarters to take certain narratives on board which lead to more, not less conflict. So my experience really as someone who has been negotiating in peace processes for the last 20 years is simply this, and I just want to end with this, that first of all, as Tim says, virtually every conflict on this earth has as one of its underlying drivers the concept of exclusion. And secondly, that in our experience, it is not just governments that make peace, but ultimately it's societies that make peace, it's people that make peace and who build shattered communities back together again. Thirdly, the role of civil society in all of that is absolutely crucial. And therefore, I think that actually museums, which after all are supposed to try and make sense of our human life and our human community, and art, which distills, if you like, our human experience, are terribly important places, not simply because they fulfill the traditional role of cultural diplomacy across the globe and in communities, but because I think the very essence of art, the very essence of a museum, is its recognition of the power of human agency and the power of human dignity. That's what distinguishes from all other, probably, animals on the planet. And so, in just concluding, I would say that when we look at human dignity, and if you look at everything that has transpired in the last few years, from the Arab Spring to what's happened here in Baltimore, it is not just a question of food, water, and shelter. It is also a question of human dignity, and I think human dignity and the need for human dignity in human beings is just as sort of much of a life force as the need to eat and the need to find shelter and the need to look after one's family. So that is why museums are so important, because they can finally bring this type of conversation alive, provide a sanctuary, provide a space, provide a platform for people to express themselves. The power of human testimony is extremely overwhelming when it's framed and curated in the right way. So we are extremely excited by what Chris and Tim are doing. We think it's a conversation that, although it's starting here in Baltimore, has to continue across the rest of this country and across this country to other continents. And so it's in the end, in this cauldron where human beings come together, not just over the internet, that actually we can begin to try and resolve some of our deep-seated conflicts. So I wish you all the best for the future, and just to let you know that the United Nations in all its different agencies is listening to this type of conversation. In the end, we don't just want to keep the peace, we don't want to just simply negotiate peace, we want to try and prevent conflict. And I think what Chris and Tim are trying to do is to prevent conflict here in Baltimore and provide, if you like, the foundation for human dignity to move forward. As Obama once said, the arc of history, I think, is in favor of human dignity, but it needs its foot soldiers, and I think we've just found two of them. So thank you very, very much.
I just want to thank the panel, and I want to thank all of you for being here and staying here, and this is not the last. Thank you.